On December 14, 1991, the summit of New Zealand's tallest mountain disappeared. No earthquake. No warning. Just gone. And on May 31, 1970, a wall of ice moving at 400 kilometers per hour erased an entire city in Peru. 20,000 people died in less than 4 minutes. Mountains don't just stand still. They move, crack, and fall. And when they do, the destruction is absolute. This is not about erosion over millennia. This is about catastrophic failure. From the Southern Alps to the Dolomites, from the Andes to the Caucasus, 8 mountains have collapsed in the last century alone. Some were triggered by earthquakes, others by human error. Many had no explanation at all. It was December 14, 1991 at 9:34 p.m. Seismographs across New Zealand registered a massive tremor. But this was not an earthquake. It was the summit of Aoraki, Mount Khokh breaking apart. Aoraki stands at 3,764 meters in New Zealand's Southern Alps. It is the country's tallest mountain. For the Ngāi Tahu Maori, it is sacred, an ancestor frozen in stone. That night, between 12 and 14 million cubic meters of rock tumbled down the east face. The collapse lasted minutes. No one saw it happen. No climbers. No witnesses. Only machines recorded the fall. When mountaineers returned the next day, the summit they knew was gone. 10 meters of height. Vanished. The geological cause was clear. Aoraki is built from schist, a weak, fractured rock. Glaciers had undercut the base for centuries. Seasonal freeze-thaw cycles opened cracks year after year. Water seeped in, froze, expanded. The rock could not hold. But there were no warning signs. No detectable movement. No visible instability. Climbers had been on the mountain just days before. They walked routes that no longer existed. The collapse reshaped the entire peak. Familiar ridges were gone. Navigation became uncertain. Mountaineering guides had to be rewritten. New Zealand's highest point was redefined. Maps were redrawn. The country's geographic identity shifted by 10 meters. No lives were lost. But the cultural impact was profound. For the Maori, Aoraki is not just a mountain. It is a connection to ancestors. Its collapse was felt as a spiritual wound. For climbers, it was a reminder. Mountains are not static. They do not wait for permission to fall. Aoraki's collapse was silent, sudden and unpredictable. And it proved a terrifying point. Even the most iconic peaks are fragile. The next collapse would not be so quiet. A Sunday afternoon in the Italian Dolomites. Clear skies. Full daylight. Hikers were climbing Marmolada, the highest peak in the range at 3,343 meters. It was a popular route. Families and experienced climbers. Many were roped together. Then the glacier collapsed. The date was July 3, 2022. Europe was in the grip of a record heat wave. Temperatures at the summit had reached 10 degrees Celsius, far above normal for glaciated terrain. Meltwater had been pooling beneath the ice for weeks. The liquid reduced friction between the glacier and bedrock. The mass destabilized. At 1:45 p.m., between 60,000 and 80,000 cubic meters of ice detached. The avalanche descended at 300 kilometers per hour. Water. All moving as one. 11 climbers were killed. 8 were injured. Some victims were roped together when the wave hit. They had no time to react. Rescue operations began immediately but were hindered by the instability of the remaining glacier. Helicopters hovered. Teams worked carefully. The ice was still shifting. Recovery efforts lasted days. Bodies were found buried under debris. Families waited. This was not a random event. Scientists had been monitoring Marmolada for decades. The glacier had been retreating since the 1800s. By 2022, it had lost over 80% of its volume. Climate data confirmed it. 2022 recorded the lowest ice mass on record. But no specific warning system existed. Glaciers do not collapse on schedules. The mechanics are understood: meltwater, friction loss, thermal stress. But predicting the exact moment of failure is nearly impossible. Italy responded swiftly. Monitoring systems were upgraded. Debate began over whether access to glaciated peaks should be restricted during heat waves. Some argued for closures. Others said mountains cannot be made safe. The truth lies somewhere in between. Marmolada's collapse was predictable in general terms. Scientists knew glaciers were thinning. They knew warming summers increased risk. But they could not say when or where. Unlike Aoraki, which fell in darkness with no witnesses, Marmolada collapsed in daylight on a crowded route. The victims were not careless. They were on a normal climb. The mountain gave no sign until it was too late. Climate change had turned ice into a weapon. At 4:10 a.m., the town of Frank, Alberta, was asleep. Then Turtle Mountain fell. 82 million tons of limestone broke free from the summit at 2,100 meters. The rockslide moved at 100 kilometers per hour. It lasted 90 seconds. In that time, 3 square kilometers of the valley were buried. At least 70 people were killed. The true death toll may never be known. Most victims were in their beds. Survivors described waking to a sound like thunder. Then silence. Houses vanished. The Canadian Pacific Railway line was destroyed. Boulders the size of buildings covered the town. The cause was clear. Coal mining had been operating at the base of Turtle Mountain since 1901. Tunnels had destabilized the rock. Freeze-thaw cycles had weakened the limestone for years. Water seeped into cracks, froze, and expanded. The mountain's internal structure was compromised. Local indigenous peoples had long avoided the area. They knew the mountain was unstable, but their warnings were ignored. When the collapse came, it was catastrophic. 17 miners were working underground when the slide hit. The entrance was buried. They were trapped in total darkness, surrounded by rubble. Rescue teams dug for hours. All 17 were pulled out alive. Above ground, survivors clawed through debris searching for families. Some were found. Many were not. Bodies remained buried for weeks. Some were never recovered. The town of Frank was partially rebuilt, but the slide zone was abandoned. It remains untouched today, a field of massive boulders visible from space. And Turtle Mountain is still moving. Geologists have monitored the peak continuously since the 1930s. Instruments detect slow, ongoing shifts in the rock. Cracks are widening. The summit is unstable. Scientists estimate another collapse is inevitable. They cannot predict when. The mountain that killed 70 people in 90 seconds is not finished. Turtle Mountain stands as a warning. Mining at the base of unstable peaks has consequences. Ignoring geological signs has consequences. The town disappeared in the dark. The scars remain in daylight. Where Aoraki fell silently and Marmolada collapsed in a heat wave, Turtle Mountain was destroyed by human error and natural instability combined. The next disaster would prove even deadlier and entirely preventable. Mount Khokh collapsed into the Vajont Reservoir in northern Italy. 260 million cubic meters of rock slid into the water. The displacement created a wave 250 meters high. It overtopped the dam and erased 5 towns in minutes. 1,910 people were killed. This was not a natural disaster. This was a disaster that was predicted, documented, and ignored. In 1960, the Vajont Dam was completed. It was one of the tallest dams in the world at 262 meters. A massive reservoir was filled at the base of Mount Khokh, a 1,921-meter peak in the Veneto region. Almost immediately, geologists observed the mountain moving. Cracks appeared on the slopes. Small landslides occurred. Instruments measured the shifts. Reports were filed. Warnings were issued. The mountain was destabilizing. The cause was understood. The artificial reservoir increased groundwater pressure within Mount Khokh. Ancient clay layers deep inside the mountain became saturated. Friction was lost. The rock mass began to slide. Engineers knew this. They measured it. They documented it. But the dam was not emptied. Operations continued. The reservoir remained full. On October 9, 1963, the mountain let go. At 10:39 p.m., 260 million cubic meters of limestone, clay, and rock slid into the reservoir in a single mass. The event lasted less than a minute. The water had nowhere to go. A mega tsunami surged upward, reaching 250 meters above the dam. It overtopped the structure and roared down the valley at devastating speed. The towns of Longarone, Perego, Rivolta, Villanova, and Fay were obliterated. Buildings were flattened. Entire families vanished. When the water receded, 1,910 people were confirmed dead. The dam itself remained intact. Structurally, it had not failed. But functionally, it had killed nearly 2,000 people. Survivors described the sound: a roar like an explosion, then the rush of water. Those who ran to higher ground survived. Those who stayed were swept away. The legal aftermath was swift. Trials began in 1968. Engineers and officials were charged with manslaughter. Several were convicted. The case became a landmark in engineering liability and corporate responsibility. The disaster exposed a fatal flaw: engineering hubris. The belief that human structures could control nature without consequence. Mount Khokh had given every warning: press, movement, landslides. Geologists had called for evacuation. They were overruled. Unlike Turtle Mountain, where warnings were vague, the Vajont disaster was forensically documented. Data existed. Evidence was clear. The decision to ignore it was not a failure of knowledge. It was a failure of judgment. The dam still stands today, empty, a monument to the cost of ignoring science. The next collapse would surpass even Vajont in scale and speed. It was May 31, 1970. A 7.9 magnitude earthquake struck off the coast of Peru. 3 minutes later, the north peak of Huascarán collapsed. Huascarán is Peru's highest mountain at 6,768 meters. It towers over the Cordillera Blanca, a range of glaciated peaks in the Andes. When the earthquake hit, between 50 and 100 million cubic meters of ice and rock broke free from the summit. The debris avalanche descended at 400 kilometers per hour. It traveled 18 kilometers in under 4 minutes. The city of Yungay and the town of Ranraherka stood directly in its path. Over 20,000 people were killed. This is the deadliest mountain collapse in recorded history. The earthquake was the trigger, but Huascarán was already unstable. Glaciers on the north face had been retreating for decades. Meltwater weakened the ice-rock interface. Seismic activity destabilized the peak. When the quake struck at 3:23 p.m., the mountain let go. The avalanche was not just ice. It was a mixture of ice, rock, mud, and water, a fast-moving slurry that liquefied as it descended. The mass picked up speed on the steep slopes, funneling through narrow valleys. Yungay had no warning. It was a Sunday afternoon. Families were at home. Children were playing. The earthquake had passed. People thought the danger was over. Then the roar began. Survivors described a sound like a jet engine. A wall of debris appeared over the ridge. It was hundreds of meters wide. The city had seconds. Most people ran. They had nowhere to go. The avalanche hit Yungay at 3:26 p.m. The city vanished under meters of mud, ice, and boulders. Only 300 people survived. Most of them had been in the town cemetery, which sat on higher ground. They watched the city disappear below them. The town of Ranraherka was also destroyed. Entire families were erased. This was not the first time Huascarán had collapsed. In 1962, a smaller avalanche from the same peak killed 4,000 people in Ranraherka. Warnings were issued. Evacuation plans were discussed. Nothing was done. When the 1970 collapse came, it was 8 years too late. Today, Yungay is a mass grave. Palm trees mark where the plaza once stood. A new town was built nearby, but the old site remains untouched. Huascarán is still active. Glaciers continue to retreat. Monitoring systems are in place, but prediction remains difficult. The mountain that killed 20,000 people in 4 minutes is still unstable. Where Vajont was ignored despite warnings, Huascarán was ignored after a previous disaster. The cost of inaction was measured in cities. The next collapse would be smaller in scale, but no less symbolic. May 3, 2003. Hikers arrived at Cannon Mountain in New Hampshire expecting to see the Old Man of the mountain. It was gone. The Old Man was not a peak. It was a rock formation, 5 horizontal granite ledges stacked 370 meters above the valley floor. From a distance, they formed the profile of a human face. It had been New Hampshire's state symbol since 1805. It appeared on license plates, currency, and official seals. Generations grew up with it. Tourists came to see it. Engineers knew it was unstable. Cables were installed in 1916 to hold the ledges together. Steel rods and turnbuckles were added in the 1950s. Epoxy was applied in the 1990s. Stabilization efforts spanned nearly a century. But erosion does not stop. Freeze-thaw cycles had been attacking the formation for thousands of years. Water seeped into cracks, froze in winter, expanded, and widened the gaps. Each season, the structure weakened. On the night of May 2, 2003, the Old Man fell. No earthquake, no storm, just the slow, inevitable force of nature. When hikers arrived the next morning, only bare rock remained. The face was gone. Debris lay scattered at the base. No one was injured, but the cultural loss was massive. The public reaction was immediate. Memorials were held. Proposals were made to rebuild or project the image with lasers. Nothing could replace it. The Old Man had stood for at least 10,000 years. Human intervention extended its life by decades, maybe a century. But in the end, gravity and water won. This collapse was different from the others. No lives were lost. No towns buried. But it proved a point that applies to every peak, every formation, every mountain we depend on. Nature does not respect symbolism. Where Huascarán killed 20,000 in minutes and Vajont was predicted but ignored, the old man collapsed despite every effort to save it. Engineers tried. Science tried. It fell anyway. The next disaster would return to human error and ignored warnings that cost over 100 lives. Elm Mountain collapsed above the village of Elm, Switzerland. This was not a natural disaster. This was industrial negligence. 115 people were killed. In the 1870s, a slate quarry was opened on Elm Mountain, approximately 600 meters above the village. Slate was in demand. Mining operations expanded rapidly. By August 1881, workers noticed cracks forming in the rock face above the quarry. They reported it. Engineers were called. Inspections were conducted. The conclusion: mining could continue. The warnings were dismissed. On September 11th, the mountain proved them wrong. At 5:30 p.m., the first rockfall occurred. A section of the quarry face broke away. Debris tumbled down the slope. Villagers heard it. Some ran. Others watched from their homes, uncertain of the danger. Minutes later, the second collapse began. 10 million cubic meters of rock detached in a single mass. The debris traveled at high speed, crossing 2 kilometers of valley floor in seconds. Homes were buried. Families were crushed. The sound was heard 10 kilometers away. When the dust settled, 115 people were dead. The cause was clear. Overmining had removed structural support from the base of the rock face. The mountain had been hollowed out. Freeze-thaw weathering had accelerated the instability, widening cracks and loosening the remaining rock. Engineers had seen the cracks. They had the data. They made the wrong call. Eyewitness accounts described the terror. The first rockfall gave a brief warning. Those who ran toward higher ground survived. Those who hesitated or stayed in their homes were killed. The legal aftermath was significant. Mining regulations across Europe were revised. The Elm disaster became a case study in industrial liability and geological oversight. It also contributed to early scientific research into rockslide mechanics, the speed, the distance, and the behavior of large debris flows. The lesson was brutal: mountains cannot be carved without consequence. Unlike the Old Man, which fell despite stabilization efforts, Elm Mountain collapsed because stabilization was never attempted. The warnings were there. The cracks were visible. The decision to continue mining was not ignorance. It was arrogance. Where Vajont ignored geologists and Turtle Mountain ignored indigenous knowledge, Elm ignored its own workers. The final collapse would combine natural instability with a mystery that remains unsolved. The Kolka Glacier on Mount Dzhimarai Khokh in Russia's Caucasus Mountains collapsed. Between 100 and 130 million cubic meters of ice and rock detached from the slopes at 4,780 meters. The mass descended at 180 kilometers per hour. It traveled 20 kilometers down the Genelden Valley in minutes. The village of Karmadon was directly in its path. At least 125 people were killed. Among the dead was Sergei Bodrov Jr., a famous Russian actor and director. He was filming a documentary on glaciers in the valley. His crew captured the collapse on camera. Minutes later, they were all dead. The avalanche buried Karmadon entirely. A health spa resort vanished under ice and debris. Only one person in the village survived. This was not a typical ice avalanche. The Kolka collapse behaved unlike anything scientists had seen. The ice mixed with saturated mud and rock, creating a fast-moving slurry that liquefied as it descended. The mass picked up sediment, gaining weight and speed. It moved like a fluid. It destroyed like a hammer. The cause remains debated. Some scientists believe geothermal heating beneath the glacier destabilized the ice. Others point to possible volcanic activity in the region. Glacial surging, a sudden, rapid movement of ice, has also been proposed. No single explanation has been confirmed. What is known? The Kolka Glacier had a history of instability. In 1902, a smaller collapse from the same glacier killed 32 people. Warnings were documented. The glacier was known to surge periodically. But the 2002 event was unprecedented in scale and speed. Recovery efforts began immediately but were hindered by ongoing instability. The debris field was unstable. Aftershocks and additional ice movement made rescue operations dangerous. Many bodies were never recovered. They remain buried under ice and rock. The disaster shocked Russia. Bodrov was a national figure. His death brought international attention to the collapse. Scientific investigations began. Data was collected. Expeditions were launched. But even today, the Khokh collapse is not fully understood. Unlike Elm, where the cause was overmining, or Vajont, where the reservoir destabilized the mountain, Khokh's trigger remains unclear. Was it heat? Seismic activity? Climate change? A combination? The uncertainty makes it more terrifying. Where Huascarán was triggered by an earthquake and Marmolada by a heatwave, Khokh collapsed without a clear external force. The mountain gave no warning. The glacier moved without precedent. And 125 people, including a film crew documenting the very thing that killed them, were erased in minutes. The Khokh Glacier collapse stands as one of the most studied and least understood mountain disasters in modern history. The ice became a weapon. The cause remains a mystery. 8 mountains. 8 collapses. 120 years. Mountains are not permanent. They are dynamic systems shaped by geology, climate, and time. Some collapses are triggered by earthquakes. Others by erosion or glacial melting. Many are accelerated by human activity, mining, reservoirs, climate change. The risk is growing. Glaciers are thinning worldwide. Permafrost is melting in alpine zones. Rockfall frequency is increasing. Monitoring technology has improved, but prediction remains difficult. Aoraki gave no warning. Marmolada collapsed in daylight on a popular route. Kolka remains unexplained. Others were predicted and ignored. Vajont. Turtle Mountain. Geologists issued warnings. Engineers documented cracks. Operations continued. Thousands died. Today, millions of people live near unstable mountains. Tourism continues in high-risk zones. Infrastructure is built on unstable slopes. The question is not if more mountains will collapse. It is when, and whether we will listen this time. The mountains are falling. The warnings are clear. We have the science. We have the data. We have the history. What we lack is the will to act. Mountains do not wait for permission. They do not negotiate. They move on geological time until they move in seconds. These 8 collapses are not anomalies. They are warnings. The next one is already forming. Cracks are widening. Ice is thinning. Rock is shifting. Somewhere, right now, a mountain is preparing to fall. The only question is whether anyone will be listening when it does.